Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Right. So today we're really going to dig deep, like really deep. We're diving into JF. I mean, those Southern Democrats were like fiercely opposed to integration.
Oh, absolutely. And they had a ton of power in Congress. Like, they were determined to keep things segregated no matter what.
It's hard to grasp that now.
Oh, it was a whole different world.
It really was.
And on top of that, public opinion was all over the place, even outside the South.
Yeah, public opinion is huge, right? Like, it can totally make or break a president's agenda, especially on something as controversial as civil rights.
Oh, yeah. Public opinion is everything in politics. And then, of course, you have the Supreme Court. They're issuing these landmark decisions on segregation, like Brown v. Board of Education.
Separate but equal, gone.
Exactly. But here's the thing. The court can't actually enforce its own rulings. They need the president and Congress to, actually make desegregation happen.
So it's like a chain. If one link breaks.
Yeah, it all falls apart. And Kennedy's stuck right in the middle of it all.
Right in the hot seat. So it sounds like he was trying to walk this tightrope, right?
Yeah.
Between his own ideals and what was actually politically possible.
Oh, totally. And a perfect example of that is the whole stroke of a pen thing. You remember that?
Oh, yeah, during the 1960 campaign?
Right. He basically said he could end housing discrimination just like that, with a signature.
Snap, just like that.
And it resonated, especially with Black Americans who, face so many barriers to owning homes. But once he got into office, things didn't move as fast on that front.
I remember reading about those activists. They sent pens to the White House.
Right?
To, remind Kennedy of his promise. Such a powerful image.
It really is. And it shows the frustration, among civil rights advocates. It wasn't just about the policy. It was about, the symbolism. Kennedy was this beacon of hope. And when his actions didn't live up to his words, it was a real letdown.
So what about the housing order? Did he end up signing anything? He did. He eventually signed an executive order on housing discrimination, but it was a lot narrower than what he had initially promised.
How so?
Well, it only applied to new housing projects that were getting federal funding. Existing discriminatory practices, they were pretty much left untouched.
So not the sweeping change he had, promised on the campaign trail.
Nope, not even close. It's a perfect example of how his, lofty rhetoric crashed into the reality of governing.
Campaign promises, eh? Always gotta love those.
And another example, his attempt to tackle voting rights. They proposed this bill that would have made it easier for people with a 6th grade education to vote. They were trying to get rid of those literacy tests they used to disenfranchise Black voters in the South.
Wait, a 6th grade education? That was a requirement.
Yeah. Crazy, right?
Wow. What happened to that bill?
Those Southern Democrats, they blocked it. Completely. They were like a wall. Remember the Southern Manifesto?
Oh, yeah. A whole bunch of Southern congressmen basically saying, we're not going to integrate no matter what the Supreme Court says.
Exactly. They were determined to protect segregation, and they had the power to do it.
So Kennedy was, up against it.
Mm-hmm.
I bet that same resistance also affected how he dealt with the 1963 Civil Rights Bill, right? The big one.
You got it. That bill was meant to tackle everything: voting rights, public accommodations, the whole shebang.
A big swing.
But right from the start, it faced fierce opposition. Southern lawmakers were ready to fight tooth and nail to protect segregation.
So is it DOA, dead on arrival?
Not quite. It got stalled in Congress, but the fight wasn't over. The really sad part is it was still stuck when Kennedy was assassinated.
That's tragic. Who knows what would happen if he had more time? But let's talk about public opinion for a second. You said it was a big factor in how Kennedy approached civil rights. What were people's views back then?
Man, it was a divided country. I mean, the civil rights movement was gaining support, especially among young people, but there was a lot of resistance to change, too, especially, among white Southerners. And that definitely influenced how Kennedy handled things.
Yeah, those polls from September 63 are pretty eye-opening, right?
Yeah.
89% of Black Americans approved of Kennedy, but 70% of Southern whites thought he was pushing integration too fast.
Yep. That pretty much sums it up. He was trying to appeal to a nation that was deeply divided on race.
Two Americas, almost.
It really was. And it wasn't just the South either. A lot of people outside the South also felt he was pushing too hard. It was a real balancing act for him.
Politically.
Politically, yeah. He knew that if he went too far too fast, he could trigger a backlash and, that could sink his whole presidency.
So he was stuck between a rock and a hard place, huh?
Yep, pretty much. Trying to make everyone happy, and that's impossible with an issue like this. And then, of course, you have Birmingham in '63, those images of, peaceful protesters, kids even, being attacked with fire hoses and police dogs.
Man, it's hard to even think about those images.
Brutal.
They changed everything, didn't they?
Yeah. For a lot of white Americans who weren't really sure about civil rights before, Birmingham was a turning point. Even Kennedy himself said that it forced him to confront how urgent the situation was.
A wake-up call. But sadly, it came late in his presidency.
Yeah, too late.
It's like heartbreaking to think about those images and what they represent. So public opinion was like this constantly shifting thing that Kennedy had to like navigate carefully.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just that, right? We also got to talk about the Supreme Court and their rulings on segregation.
Oh, yeah, the Supreme Court. They were a big part of the story, too. They added another layer of complexity to the whole thing.
Okay, let's unpack that. This is where it gets really fascinating.
You know, when we talk about the Supreme Court and Kennedy, got to remember, they were making these huge rulings on desegregation. But they couldn't actually enforce them themselves.
Oh, right. So they could say, you know, segregation is wrong, but they couldn't make people stop doing it.
Exactly. So Kennedy was stuck in the middle again. He had to, you know, uphold the court's decisions, but also deal with the reality on the ground. It was a tough spot.
Yeah. Talk about pressure. So how'd the South react to these rulings? I'm guessing they weren't thrilled.
You guessed right. A lot of southern states engaged in what historians call massive resistance. Basically, they were going to defy the Supreme Court and keep segregation no matter what.
Wow. So what did that look like? What were they actually doing to block integration?
Oh, he had a whole playbook. Passing laws to get around the court's rulings, shutting down public schools rather than integrate them.
Really? Shutting them down?
Oh, yeah. And sometimes they used violence and intimidation, to scare Black people from using their rights.
It's crazy how much resistance there was.
Yeah.
Did he try to stop it?
He tried, but he had to be careful. He needed those Southern Democrats in Congress to pass any laws. He couldn't, totally alienate them.
Right. Pick your battles.
Exactly. And plus, he was worried about white voters, especially in the South, didn't want to lose their support.
So even when they were, openly breaking the law, he had to tread lightly.
It was a tough situation. And then, got to remember the Cold War.
Oh, yeah. The U.S. versus the Soviets.
Yeah.
The whole world watching.
Right. And segregation in America, that wasn't a good look for the U.S., trying to be the leader of the free world and all that.
It kind of makes you look like a hypocrite, right?
Oh, for sure. The Soviets ate it up. They were like, see, America talks about freedom, but they don't even treat their own people equally.
Propaganda gold.
Yeah, basically. So Kennedy was under pressure, not just at home, but internationally. He had to do something about racial inequality.
Makes sense. So the Cold War definitely played a part in his actions on civil rights.
Oh, absolutely. Some historians, especially those who, focus on the Cold War, they argue that that's a big reason why Kennedy pushed for civil rights to make America look better on the world stage.
It's kind of cynical, but I get it.
Yeah. But let's not forget about the civil rights movement itself. Those activists, they were the ones on the front lines putting their lives at risk to make change happen.
The real heroes.
Yeah. Groups like the NAACP, SCLC, SNCC, they were organizing protests, fighting those discriminatory laws in court, and getting people involved all over the country.
They were the ones, really pushing Kennedy to, finally do something.
Oh, for sure. They were the ones making noise, putting the issue front and center, making it impossible for Kennedy to ignore. They were changing the whole conversation.
Powerful stuff.
And they were doing it at great risk to themselves, facing violence, arrests, you name it.
Like the Freedom Rides. Just incredible courage, riding those buses through the South, knowing what they might face.
Seriously, it was amazing. They knew they might not come back.
And it was their actions, along with the Supreme Court and, the pressure from the whole world, that finally forced Kennedy to act.
Right. Yeah. He had to do something. Sending in federal marshals to protect the Freedom Riders, pushing for desegregation. He finally started using the power of the government to challenge Jim Crow head on.
So we got all these forces at play.
Yeah.
The courts, Congress, public opinion, the whole world watching, and of course the civil rights movement itself.
That's like a big puzzle,
Totally.
Yeah.
And it sounds like historians have a lot of different opinions about, how all of this shaped Kennedy's legacy on civil rights.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And that's what we're going to explore next. We'll dive into all the different ways people view his legacy. Some see him as, a reluctant hero, while others think he was more of a follower than a leader. It's a fascinating debate.
I'm ready. Let's do it.
It's wild, right? Like, historians look at Kennedy and civil rights and they see totally different things. Some of them, those revisionist historians, they say, hey, he gets too much credit. They think he was more like reacting to stuff instead of actually leading the charge.
So they're saying he wasn't really a true civil rights champion.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of. They think he was more worried about, staying popular and getting reelected than, really pushing for big changes. They point to guys like Howard Zinn.
Right.
Who believed the real heroes were the activists, the people risking it all on the streets.
Makes sense. But we were talking about the Cold War earlier. Some historians think that played a big role.
Huge role. Some historians, especially the ones who, focus on that era, they argue that Kennedy was really worried about how segregation made America look to the rest of the world. Like, here we are fighting the Soviets, trying to be the good guys, and we've got all this racism at home.
Yeah, tough sell.
Totally. And that's where scholars like Mary Dudziak come in. They argue that Kennedy knew this. He knew it looked bad. And so they think some of his actions on civil rights were like PR moves to improve America's image.
So not just about doing the right thing, but also about winning the Cold War.
Yep. 2 birds, 1 stone. But of course, you can't talk about civil rights without talking about the movement itself.
Right, the people on the ground making it happen.
Exactly. Those civil rights historians, they focus on the courage and the strategy of the movement. They say it wasn't just, outside pressure that forced change. It was the activists, the organizers, the people putting their lives on the line every single day.
So they're giving credit where credit is due.
Big time. They talk about groups like the NAACP, SNCC, SCLC. They say those folks deserve a ton of credit for the progress made during Kennedy's time.
People like Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, Dr. King and, all those other brave folks.
So it sounds like historians are kind of split on Kennedy, right?
Yeah.
Some think he was a reluctant hero, pushed into action by events, while others say he was more of a follower.
Yeah, it's a debate, for sure. And then you've got those institutional historians. They look at the big picture, like the whole structure of American politics.
Okay.
They point out that Kennedy had to deal with Congress, especially those Southern Democrats who would block anything that, threatens segregation.
Yeah, we talked about him. Powerful guys.
Yeah, super powerful. And those historians say, look, even if Kennedy wanted to do more, he was kind of stuck, He had to work within the system.
Right. Got to play the game.
Exactly. So, yeah, it's complicated. But thinking about all that, I keep coming back to a few moments where Kennedy did, really take a stand. Like the University of Mississippi in '62. Remember James Meredith?
Oh, yeah. The first black student to enroll there.
Right. And Governor Barnett, he literally stood in the doorway to stop Meredith from registering.
Wow.
It was crazy. And Kennedy had to send in federal marshals and the National Guard to enforce the court order.
Wow.
Powerful moment. The federal government saying, nope, segregation's over.
So how did people react?
Mixed bag, as you can imagine. Segregationists were furious, obviously, but even some civil rights activists thought Kennedy could have done more to prevent the violence that broke out. 2 people were killed in the riots.
Man, that's awful. Sounds like no matter what he did, someone was going to be upset. What about the freedom rides? That was a big deal too, right?
Oh, definitely. And it shows how Kennedy's approach was kind of all over the place. You had these incredibly brave activists, black and white, riding buses through the South to challenge segregation.
Yeah, and getting attacked.
Brutally attacked. By mobs, by some cops even. And at first, Kennedy's team, they were hesitant to get involved. They thought maybe the states could handle it.
But it got out of control, really.
Oh, yeah. Those images of the burning bus in Anniston, Alabama, they went everywhere. And people were outraged. And that put a ton of pressure on Kennedy to step in.
So again, it was public pressure that forced his hand.
Pretty much. Eventually, he had to act. He sent in those marshals, put pressure on the Interstate Commerce Commission to ban segregation on buses.
So a win for the movement.
Definitely a win. But it's interesting, right? It seems like Kennedy often waited until things blew up before he really acted.
So he was reactive, not proactive.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It makes you wonder if he'd been bolder, taken more risks earlier on. Who knows what might have happened?
But we got to remember, like you said, segregation was deeply ingrained in society.
Yeah.
It wasn't going to disappear overnight.
No way. And Kennedy was working within a system that, that often made it hard to change things quickly.
It's a good reminder that leaders, even the good ones, are limited by the circumstances,
For sure. It's a tough job.
Yeah.
Trying to do the right thing, but also trying to, survive politically. So, yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap up our look at Kennedy and civil rights. It's a complicated legacy, for sure.
Full of, contradictions and compromises.
Yeah. He did some good, but he could have done more. And sadly, we'll never know what he might have accomplished if things had been different.
This has been really eye-opening.
Yeah, JFK and civil rights.
Hmm.
It's something we should keep talking about, keep learning from.
Absolutely. And on that note, we encourage everyone listening to, check out the sources we use for this deep dive. Do your own research. Keep the conversation going.
It's a conversation we all need to be a part of.
Well said. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.